Welcome to the Signal and Noise podcast. Man, this is going to be a fantastic episode. This episode is brought to you by ROI Rocket. We are a market once company. My name is Brian Lamar. My co-host, as always, Andrew DeCilles. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. I have some fabulous hat head from digging myself out from under 28 inches of snow here in Batesville, Indiana. I'm severely regretting purchasing a house that the garage is underneath it. 7 feet is a lot to throw snow up out of my driveway.
Yeah,
But
those
other
of
than
us.
that, I'm great. Lots of fun for the kids to play in the snow. No other complaints.
Awesome. Those of us in the Midwest, South, Northeast, all got hit really hard just this past weekend. But we're so fortunate to have, despite this weather, a bunch of guests on the case. I'm just going to call it CASE4Quality group, who we've been trying to talk to for a long time, and I've known for a long time. And I'm super happy with this discussion. I think this is going to be worth your attention. I'm going to kick it off. We have Mary Beth Weber, by the way. We have Tia Maurer. I'm going to let all of them introduce themselves, Efrain Ribeiro and Karine Pepin. And I'm going to kick it off to Mary Beth Weber. Maybe for those of you that don't know you, give us a little background introduction and what CASE is.
Mary Beth Weber. I spent a number of years in the market research side working for a company that was Sigma Validation. Sigma was actually put into business by brands. So it was created by brands, for brands, and we were ensuring compliance to research standards at the time. So this has been a topic that is near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I'm Efrain Ribeiro. I spent half my career in media research, the first part, just probably the unknown part. And then the latter part, I spent building panels for TNS, Ipsos, and Kantar. I retired in 2016, and I made the mistake of picking up the phone when Mary Beth called me. And she convinced me to use what little expertise I have to help her out. And I've been with CASE for 8 years.
You're very humble. If there's a Mount Rushmore of online sampling and data quality, you're on it for sure. I think, is it Tia that don't you call him the Godfather of Sample or someone?
Yes, he is the Godfather of Sampling.
That's what my business card says.
It should. Karine, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Karine Pepin. I've been in the industry for over 20 years. Almost all of it has been in consulting, end-to-end, full service. And recently I co-founded my own agency, but I'm a researcher, and I'm especially interested in quality because I have to use the data, I have to show up in front of the clients, and I have to be confident in what I'm showing. So I joined CASE4Quality about a year ago after writing a lot of posts on LinkedIn for a couple of years.
Yes, we snatched her up. We saw how active and engaged she was and how sincere she was, and that she really is hands-on testing all the fraud technologies out there. So she is a huge asset to CASE.
Absolutely. A big fan of Karine. And also, finally, last but not least, Tia.
My name is Tia Maurer. I work at Procter & Gamble. I'm in the R&D part of the organization. I've been in the products research function. This is my 29th year. And half of my career I spent as a capability actually building my own panels and helping people accomplish their research, both internal and external to the company. And the other half I spent in a traditional products research role where I was commissioning my own research, designing and executing and analyzing. So I've seen end-to-end the poor data quality go down the tubes for probably the better part of the last 12 years.
We are all on this because we're all members of CASE, first of all, but we're also passionate about data quality. And Mary Beth, you kind of touched on a little bit about CASE, but maybe tell us a little bit more about CASE and what it's done in the past.
Yes, and I also just want to say about Tia. So Micah Lancourt was telling me at one of the conferences, you have to hook up with Tia Maurer. She's very huge on data quality at P&G, and she is hugely the data quality guru at P&G. So we've been partners in crime for many, many years. So just for CASE, it stands for the Coalition for Advancing Sampling Excellence. We officially launched in 2018. We had a kickoff meeting in New York around the ARF time when they were doing their one of their Rethink, I think, conferences. And Brian was there, everyone was there. I know Michael Lancourt was there. And basically, Melanie Courtwright was there. We had a whole room of brands and research leaders, chief executives for all of the major research companies at the time there. And in 2020 is when Tia and I partnered on going to Quirks and doing a presentation on the data quality things that Tia was seeing. And we started talking about we need to do a research study. So we had met Tim Hoskins there. Hoskins, he was a quester, and he's like, whatever you want to do, he would chip in and pay for it. And we're like, no, we will not take any money from any suppliers, because we felt that the study really needed to be completely unbiased, and we should be free to say whatever we want to say, whatever the findings are that came out, whether it be good or bad about the industry. And then Efrain said, a good topic would be fraud. That's kind of taboo in the industry. Nobody ever talks about fraud. So we conducted the study on fraud, which was published. We presented it in 2022, and we did it was one of the most well-attended, or the most well-attended town hall for the Insights Association ever. And we exposed that respondents were completing more surveys than is humanly possible, and they were able to get through fraud detection. And that's what's become very frustrating, I think, for all of us, is that's a huge, huge issue. It's basically saying that we don't have enough supply to meet demand. So we have a lot of professional respondents, we have fraud, we have different things that are going on, and we just feel that issue really has not been tackled as it should have been tackled. CASE is a nonprofit. It's independent. It's researchers and experts, thought leaders. Everybody's volunteering. What makes us different is that the agenda is driven by brands. We're only want to make sure that we have the brand's interest in mind. And again, that's what allows us to be able to openly share what's going on in data quality and in any of the findings that we have.
Well, thank you for that. Awesome. It's hard for us on the supply side to kind of get FaceTime with brands, and a lot of the suppliers, additionally, as part of their job, if this isn't a negative, kind of hide a lot of the data quality issues and fix them prior to the brands getting to know them. And so this has been, to me, in my opinion, more transparency the better. And so this has been a very transparent association that you've created. And I'd love to hear from Tia from the brand side, how and why she decided to kind of get on board. And you've certainly been, I've seen you quoted, I've heard some of your famous quotes in these webinars over the past few years. Certainly outspoken about data quality, and I'm curious how you kind of got involved.
Yeah, I actually, in my second role at P&G back in 2002 to 2008, I started the Fabric and Home Care Innovation Center Consumer Village Research Facility. And so I was the manager of that facility. We built a local database. We had a handful of, kitchens and living rooms and places where people could do research and shopper research. And we would recruit people in, and we did it by phone recruit, the old-fashioned way back in the day. And so we were recruiting people to come in and do research studies, but we even had folks that we called running the screener. So they would, try to overqualify by saying they used a whole bunch of different things that in combination, some of them were low incidence that wasn't really possible. And so my recruiters were actually trained to kind of detect that when they thought somebody wasn't going to be the right target audience, and they would tell them they didn't qualify. And sometimes they would challenge and say, well, I used all the products that you mentioned. And we said, sorry, ma'am, we're looking for non-users of those products right now for our research. And we would thank them and tell them when another study came up, we would certainly call them. And so that gave me a thought that, you know what, if they're trying to perpetrate a fraud to get into qual research, then I would imagine that they might be perpetrating a fraud to do quantitative research. And at that time, online surveying had started to become a thing. And I actually picked the tool that our company was going to use to do online surveying. And I wrote the user guide for that and trained a lot of the people in the company. And at that time, I then moved into a standard products research role. And when I did that, I started commissioning my own large scale research. And in one part of it, I started to build my own nationwide panel. And I had somebody try to defraud the panel. I got hit with a bot that I had 1,000 people sign up to be part of the panel, and 300 were a bot. And so I realized right then that people were trying to cheat to do things. So I very quickly started to have that discriminating eye on all of my studies.
And Efrain, you've been doing this for quite a while, as you mentioned in your intro. What Tia's experiencing is probably not a huge surprise to you. Maybe talk a little bit about what you've seen in your days, building panels and being passionate about quality.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely isn't a surprise. And it was the reason why I suggested that we do fraud, because it was a simple subject in the sense that it's easy to understand rather than sampling theory. Because I think initially CASE was going to look at the way we're currently doing sampling with survey walls and routers. And that's like the quickest way to lose audience. Fraud seemed to be like a very simple thing. And from the beginning, when I started building online panels, back in 1997, we started getting hit, but it was direct hits with hackers coming in and going after the actual incentive, taking down everything. So it wasn't necessarily impacting in the initial days the data that was being put together, because you could, if somebody came in, they didn't want to do surveys. They wanted to get access to the incentive dollars. But after, I'm sure that most companies got hit with that. And so as the different companies built up their protection, and to build up the protection, you needed like a staff of 2 or 3 developers. And you know how difficult it ever is in businesses to get 3 developers, and they have to be expert on security to build up the defenses for that. After that first phase, we started seeing the fraud actually get into studies and participate in major trackers, where we would like find people from China representing like a quarter of this tracker sample, and then having to work back and try to figure out. So it's something that's there, and it's still there. To be honest, I never thought that fraud was as big as some of these other things. But when we did this report that we talked about back in 2022, the thing that actually scared me the most, and I thought that there would be a revolution within the client base of research, was the fact that there were people that were taking 25, 30, 40, 50 surveys a day. And in our study, we let the people go through. And the amazing thing was that about half of them, they knew what they were doing because they did not trip any other quality checks. That means they passed, all these different fraud checks, et cetera, and then they went through. So frankly, I thought at that point that we were going to see a very, worried and interested industry to figure out how we were going to deal with this. And frankly, I'm really underwhelmed at what has, occurred. There's been some movement. There's been some things that have moved forward. I think the fact that we have people like Karine, young researchers that are interested in this topic, that are hopefully going to work, through their careers, tackling this thing. But it's the young people that are in this that are probably the most positive aspect of it. Unfortunately, I spent 20, 30 years in this, and I know that I had a reluctance to, get back into the water when Mary Beth called me up. So I don't know. It can get pretty frustrating to see the little progress, because in fact, I think fraud rates now are probably higher than the ones we reported back in 2022. So
Thank you for that. I'm going to get to Karine and Andrew here in a second, but I'd love for Mary Beth, prior to us recording, you had a nice little intro, I think, that I'd like to get to. Maybe I would call it kind of, what's the status of online data quality in your opinion? How are we doing as an industry? Love your thoughts on that. Then I'll get to everybody else.
As Efrain was saying, we are very underwhelmed with the response of what happened. When I was at Sigma, one of the things I saw was that the supply there wasn't enough supply to meet demand. I saw it way back then. And what put Sigma out of business is that the panels started aggregating other panels. They were telling the clients that they were using their own proprietary sample. When it wasn't their proprietary sample, they actually had relationships with all these other panels. And then they don't have any data in which they're able to actually validate respondents. They don't have email addresses. They don't have their names. They don't have telephone numbers, physical addresses. There's no other information to validate. So validation is impossible. So we've come to this point where nobody even knows. I think the clients are, I think what's happened is our entire ecosystem is now built around this false idea that we have unlimited sample. And that's because that's what they've been told every time they go to conduct a study. Oh, you want that very niche sample and you want that niche target and you want to get the data in, 24, 48 hours? No problem. Or if somebody says that is a problem, they just move to the next supplier and that supplier says no problem. And if everybody would actually be honest about it, the price for sample would naturally increase. But because so many people have just made a living of being able to fill their sample with either professional respondents or fraud, it just makes it easy. And now I think the whole ecosystem is based on this falsehood that we have this unlimited sample. And that's my concern. How do you go back? It blows up everybody's current reality of how they're currently working with data and thinking about respondents. I saw one webinar that I remember was given by a big brand, and they were saying, oh, we've empowered, our brand managers to all conduct research whenever they want to conduct research. And well, if they make a mistake, we just tell them, just do it again. It's like there's no consideration that what about the burden on the respondents? What about the pool of respondents? Like you're acting as though it doesn't even matter. And I think it's the supplier's fault for allowing brands to think that way. But they've all just competed with each other and then obfuscated the reality of what the supply situation is.
That was a very PG version, so thank you for that. The first round. I'm gonna carry. I'm gonna go to you. A newer member to CASE, but obviously very, very passionate around data quality. And I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on kind of the history of fraud and data quality and the challenges maybe it affects your role in what you're doing.
Yeah, so how I got into data quality, I remember it was 2016. I was working on on a study, and there were some issues with it, but we couldn't quite figure out what was happening at the time. So we did our thing. It looked good at the end, right? But I always wondered what happened. So it's a few years later that when I started understanding about programmatic sample and about how the panels weren't really proprietary panels anymore, I'm like, wait a minute, let me check that invoice. I had 3 sources and, I had the variables for it, went back to the data set, went back to the invoice. And that's when I realized it was the first time I was using one of the panels that in fact was not proprietary sample. But at the time I was just told it's the same thing, just cheaper. But it wasn't the same thing. It was cheaper though. And I could tell by the invoice. So, to me, there was like the golden years of online panels is before 2016 and then after 2016. And after Efrain has all sorts of stories of how before 2016, there were also issues, but it wasn't, I think it was kind of next level. And then I think maybe around when CASE did their studies, study 2021, I don't know. But then we got into like fraud, right? Not just like these people getting into surveys that really they never really sign up for a panel and they're doing a video game thing and they just want their, that was one thing. But then fraud happened, and maybe there was a lot of fraud before, but we didn't really know. But now we can track it, we can measure it, we have so many tools for it. So, I mean, from my perspective, I agree with what everything, Efrain and Mary Beth has said. But the reality is all researchers are actually like in there, right? Like we need data, right? We need to run projects. So sure, I'd love to fix the problem, but I can't fix the problem. Like that's just kind of not impossible. So what I can do is curate the traffic, like what's existing. And so I use all the tools I can find and all the checks and all this and that. And I know you hate me for it because we've had these discussions on LinkedIn, but I honestly don't know what else I can do, right? To feel like I have some control over this situation. And the thing is, at the end of the day, it kind of works, and I know we've had this discussion with CASE, right? And about like, how does it work when you block 40% of the traffic up front, you block God knows how many people in the survey for straight lining and speeding and this and that, and then you remove 20% in the back end. How does that work? I don't know. It's magic, but it does, right? It's not sustainable. I'm sure you would agree it's not sustainable, but that's the only choice we have.
Well, what you've done is you've forced yourself, because of the challenges of our industry, you've become an expert in lots of different things, in
Yeah.
quality and research design and methodology and panels and all these things. And Andrew, you're about the same time frame as Karine, actually. About you just hit your 10-year mark.
Yep.
In research, and love your thoughts on kind of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Beginning my time in this space in 2016, I've been here for the rapid decline, I'll say. And I took about a year and a half outside the space and then came back. And I would say that even just in the last 3 years, there's been, however bad it got from 2016 to 2022, we've had that same decline in just the last couple of years. The amount of panels that I trust, I can count on one hand, right? And I think, Mary Beth, you make a really good point about supply and demand. And then Karine, I went on this huge rant in one of our rant episodes about the word proprietary. You cannot have a proprietary relationship or proprietary API. If you say that to me, I'm never buying sample from you again. Like, it's crazy. And I think the problem is that, when this kind of all began, people were actually building panels and then figured out, dang, it's kind of expensive to recruit and validate a respondent. And then we don't make our ROI until they've taken 3 surveys. And if we're doing that responsibly, that kind of takes a while, but I can buy a respondent from someone else and mark it up, and boom, there's my profit right there. And you kind of just have this like shell game going on where everyone's sourcing from everyone else, and it's it's more profitable that way. I think you're right as well that when you have firms that will say the truth, like the hard truth, and I'm really interested in sales methodology, and I'm kind of examining our space. It's a really weird sales space, market research, because it's massively transactional and there's incredibly low friction to switch suppliers. So completely different from like a SaaS space where you have an annual contract or there's minimum spend agreements and things like that. So you're right that if I can just say, okay, well, you can't do what I'm going to do, this person can, and it's going to be good enough, and people make that decision again and again and again and again, you kind of end up where we are today. I'm interested though in your thoughts. Both Mary Beth and Efrain, you both said that you've been like underwhelmed in the response from the industry. And why do you think that is? Because I kind of feel like I'm in an echo chamber where we're all shouting about this. We see these as massive problems. I mean, the sample space is going to eat itself. Like we can either fix this or there are going to be no one taking online surveys. This is like level 10 for me. But I see the same thing where I don't see buying patterns changing. I don't see many people trying to change the way that they recruit panel. It's the reason why Brian and I are at ROI Rocket, because we see good fundamentals in place, and so it's just like, but that's the rarity, not the norm. Why do you think it is that everyone's not up in arms about someone taking their 49th survey that you're going to make $1 million decision off of?
Because they know they've built their whole ecosystem. Even the brands now have built it on being able to have access to unlimited sample. So when they want you to fix the panel problem, they don't want to change. They still want the panel to be able to work. Well, if you created radical transparency around what panelists, how many respondents are there really in our ecosystem? And what is the real demand for that? And if we really took a hard look at that, I think everybody would be pretty amazed. I don't think anybody really wants to look at that. Because if we started to do that, there would not be enough sample to meet the demand, and they would know it for sure. And I think that's why nobody wants to do it.
Yeah, and I think also the fact that, people are more conscious about the need to make money. They're living in a quarter by quarter business. They're not looking at the long game. And as a result of that, you're going to be willing when your boss is asking you, because you're in the research department, that you're going to have to, your budget is going to be cut by 10-15%. And lo and behold, you're able to do it because you found a DIY supplier that can provide you with dollar sample or $1.50 sample. You go for that, and then 2 or 3 years later, you discover that a lot of the sample that you've been using has been is basically on a treadmill producing results for not just you, but everybody else. It's difficult to walk that back. And I think most people in the research business that have been using the data that's being produced out of this stuff is probably scared to go back to their management and say, I think we have a serious problem. It's curious though, because I think right now this thing is raising its head in the fact that all these companies are saying, well, we have all this data and we're just going to put it into our AI, hopper, and we're going to be able to produce this synthetic data. And then the light bulb goes on. How much of that data, how much of those respondents were, fake respondents or people from Pakistan or Nigeria or Iran or wherever these people are? So I think that's it's a problem that's pretty deep. And the thing that's most frustrating is I think I think the industry, if you look at this from top above, the design, the structure of the industry has to change. Right now we have these companies called sample exchanges, which are very useful, but they're basically, people can launder their sample through them. I hate to use that word, but that's what they are. I always, and that's as long as, those type of elements are part of our industry structure, I don't see things changing very much. So,
I was going to say the same thing as Efrain about the synthetic sample. Like now people are like, oh, if we can't get real respondents and if we're having a problem with that, let's just use synthetic data. Well, where do they think the synthetic data is coming from? It's coming from those fake respondents and the fake data that was generated. Like, how do they know that that was based in reality in order to build the synthetic panels and synthetic data? So I just find that amusing. I'd love to hear Tia's thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, Mary Beth, first, we'll do an AI episode. We just signed a deal with Qualtrics to help build their synthetic panel, and so we can have another discussion in another podcast. Absolutely, I'd love to have that discussion. But Tia, as you mentioned, not that you represent all brands, and you don't even represent all of Procter and Gamble. You represent yourself, and a lot of challenges have been discussed in the past few minutes about sampling and from a brand perspective. Is there enough sample to accomplish your needs? And what are your thoughts on kind of the challenges that we're facing?
Well, there absolutely is not enough sample. We know that the major suppliers that we go to, we ask them for the size of their sample and some transparency, and that how many of our studies are they actually subcontracting to find sample through other vendors that we didn't knock on the door of when we commissioned the research. And 82 to 84% of the studies that are being conducted for Procter & Gamble through our preferred vendors are reaching out and subcontracting either through the exchanges or with other panel to panel, you can call them panel, sample, whatever you want to call them. They're doing that. So we know that the bulk of our needs are being met by not the primary vendor that we go to. And I think that there was this huge race to the bottom because anybody could curate what they called panel or curate sample and have emails of people who registered to do surveys, but there was a lack of rigorous research standards. And so anybody could jump into the game and you ended up with, subpar sample and fraud in the ecosystem because we weren't following all the right research standards. And I don't think we're complicit in the race to the bottom. All the brands are complicit because our managers, like Efrain had said, will say, hey, our research budget has been cut. What can you do for less? And how much faster can you do it? And so we're constantly hearing faster, cheaper, and faster and cheaper equals low quality because you get what you pay for. But we also at the same time have the suppliers saying, look, we have these magical softwares with online dashboards that allow you to not have to download your data and you can just create your crosstabs right here. And we can get you whatever you need. And by the way, we can do it in 5 hours or we can do it in 24 hours and you can have the answer tomorrow for your board meeting. And so with that said, I don't think anybody took a peek under the hood. You would put out your for your quote for research to maybe one of the reputable vendors, and then you would put your quote out for research to someone else. The quote looked the same, the RFP looked the same, and you end up coming back with a very different price. And so I think nobody really scratched their head and did any critical thinking to say, well, wait a minute, is this apples to apples? You're assuming that the vendor who did it cheaper, and this is dumb of us to think this, but I think you probably thought, well, they just found a more efficient way to send samples to the studies. And so therefore they cut out, some of their employees or their overhead costs, and therefore it is less expensive. And then there was this huge race to the bottom. And so, no, there's absolutely not enough supply. And the reality is, with the case study that we did with the fraud squad, we affectionately call ourselves the fraud squad, but the study that we did with CASE basically opened our eyes because there are vendors who are out there for fraud detection tools that can tell you how many times somebody tried to enter other surveys before they got to your survey. And before that, we didn't know that. And even the suppliers were obfuscating the panelist IDs. They had dynamic IDs. So, I wasn't Tia Maurer number 12345 6. I was that in one study, and in the next study I had a different number. And I think part of that reason they claim is for PII, but I think the reason that is taking place is they didn't want us to know they were reusing sample all the time.
Yeah, I typically find that when panels have something to hide is when they're the most stringent about sharing PII. People are typically shocked when we're like doing qual research with them, or there's like a quant follow-up or something like that. I'm like, yeah, like our respondents have consented to sharing their PII. You can have that if it's only like there are ways to be compliant and to move it. And I think when people will say, "Oh no, that's PII. We can't touch that. We can't do that." It's because they don't have it, either because it's an intercept, or because they bought it from somewhere else, or because of whatever reason. But that's something that Brian and I in our old days, we vetted hundreds of panels, and we used to look at the ASMR 37. We had a whole bunch of questions that we would go through to kind of determine the quality, and we've really boiled it down to like, can we have the PII? What will your recall rate be if we want to talk to your respondents tomorrow? How many of them can you get on the phone in the next hour? Right? Like those are kind of the questions that we have to use at this stage in the game, because there's so much smoke and mirrors, and it's that like one-to-one relationship where, do you have their phone number? Can you just call them? So yeah, I totally agree with you on the PII not being available, those dynamic IDs that may or may not really be to protect the respondent.
I'm going to try to be a little positive here. And Karine, I'm going to look at you too. As the least jaded amongst us, probably, although I'm sure you're sad about all the sausage, how you've seen all the sausage has been made over the past few years. Unfortunately, we have numerous fraud dashboards in our industry that have come to the industry, both within the industry and external industry over the past few years. I know you've studied them. We have various associations around the world that are working collaboratively, and I think it's the first time that they've all kind of worked collaboratively, being with peers in the industry. Does that make you feel positive about quality moving forward? How do you feel about that, Karine?
I have to be careful here. So I just think the association are trying to keep all the parties happy, and that includes also sample companies, right? And agencies, and I guess ops. I mean, I don't know, like everybody, all the parties, and everybody has very different incentive in this industry, right? Are you someone who is driven by volume or by quality? And I think at the end of the day, the loudest voice are not driven by quality.
Okay. Well, for the basis of time, you'll have about 8 to 10 minutes left. I want to give everybody a couple minutes, talk about anything they want about quality. I'll respond to the previous person if you'd like to. Mary Beth, I'd love to hear your take on what I just said around the associations working with each
Yeah.
other and things like that. I'd love your 2 minutes on this.
Okay. So first of all, with the associations coming together, I too thought it was a great thing. I thought that was amazing that everybody was coming together to work together. But there was different things that they could have done. Like, why couldn't they have conducted a big research project all together, independent, unbiased, and looked at the situation of what we're saying? Number one, supply versus demand. And number two, what's going on that we're seeing that some people are completing 100 surveys in a 24-hour period, 1,000 surveys in a 24-hour period. What does that mean? Is that really happening? Another thing is with the fraud detection firms. When we did our study, there were about 5 of them. Now, how many are there, Karine? 15, 20?
I
How
think
many?
we have 27 now in our list.
27. So, first of all, when we did our test, our fraud thing, what we were first going to do is just take those fraud detection and really just look at the ecosystem and say, how much fraud is out there? And then we were like, wait a minute, how do we even know if the fraud detection companies or if they work the technology? So we needed to test the testers. Well, is anybody testing the testers? Who's out there? Anybody and everybody is coming up. These are like 1-man, 2-man shops having these fraud detection firms. There's so many going on out there. And how do we even know how they're working? I think there needs to be an audit of that. I think the only way that the industry can work is if there are vetted panels, real proprietary panels, panels that are not aggregators who are aggregating aggregators. It has to be pure, real panels. And then maybe you have some type of exchange where you can bring those real panels together for people to get, you know, bring together big panels so that when, say, Karine goes out there and says, I'm working with panel source A, B, and C, that they truly are 3 unique sources and not a combination of all of them involved. And then the other thing, I know there was a push for ISO certification of panels. That is not something, I mean, I know that we've had these discussions at CASE, that ISO certification, all that's doing is making sure you have the processes in place that you say that you have, that you can be audited if somebody was going to audit you, but it's not changing what your data, it's not going to make an impact on data quality, but what it is going to do is really raise the price of data quality. I would rather see some type of auditing of the panels to make sure that they really do have real panelists. I would like to go back to seeing, why not have 10% of a study being audited and actually looked at that study that the supplier did what they said they were going to do, not necessarily to a particular standard, but to the standard that they're saying that they're doing with that they promised their client. So those are my last thoughts.
Oh, I love the third party audit. And that's something we did in telephone, right?
Yes, yes, you always did 10% validation, call back. And with Sigma, it was always like Sigma and then the telephone validation, and both together you would see 2 different things. If the Sigma report was clean, there was always a valid telephone validation problem. And we always were able to catch things way back when. I mean, there have been fraud in person and online studies for as long as I've been around, which is over 3 decades.
Yeah. I'm gonna go to Efrain, then Tia, then Karine, and then Andrew. Efrain, love your final
Sure.
thoughts.
Well, having come from the media research world and seen the way that we built panels there, these were, the panels that produce audience ratings, et cetera. It's definitely possible to build these types of panels that are, industrial strength across, all factors, including methodology. They just cost a little bit more, but they're viable. And what I think is one of the optimistic things that I can see is that some brands are going to go in that direction. And I think it's still possible to do that because there are people that still know how to build those type of panels. I have colleagues that work with me that were building those panels and have built those panels for some very large brands. They're getting 80% return rates on those panels, and they're not only collecting information via surveys, but they're also electronically connected so that they can check out their purchases, see what they're doing on their iPhones, etc. So I think that's something I'm much more optimistic about. And I know that sounds kind of futuristic and probably not so great to have, your life monitor that way, but that may be the way that the industry needs to go, instead of kind of living under the illusion that you're actually collecting useful information from samples that have 50% throwout rates.
Love it, Efrain. And one thing I'll say, I'm not sure, and I'll say this from a panel company perspective, is I'm not sure if those of us that do consider ourselves to have high quality panel have done a good enough job educating the industry on its value and why you should pay $5 for something that you can buy $2. And that's one of the challenges I think that some panel companies face. Tia, would love your final thoughts here.
Yeah, I would say in answer to that, I don't think we hear the claims all the time. We have proprietary, fraud detection, and we've got great panelists, and we have a database of 2 million people, and we can do this. And so at some point when you see so much fraud, you don't believe it. So you almost have to see how the sausage is made in order to believe that a vendor's actually doing it the right way. The problem that you have is, let's say ROI does it the right way, and they show us, they tell us what the right way is. And even if P&G said we're all in and we'll even give you extra money to fund to build it, you probably can't meet the demand for all the studies that we put through R&D. So eventually you've now oversampled your people, or I just don't know, how do you put controls on it and make it work? I do know that for myself, I owned my own panel and I had control over that panel. And when I knew somebody was doing something fraudulent or trying to scam the system, they got kicked out of my panel. And so I was only hosting local, studies. So I might have had 30,000 people, but they were only coming in once every 3 months for small scale qual. But when you get into quant, I get it. It's a whole lot bigger beast to try to wrangle and tackle. So how do we get, and I had a statistician say this one time. It was, I can go with 300 base and throw out half of it, or I can go with 150 really good base, have a cheaper research tab at the end of the day because I didn't ship product out to half of the people that were garbage and I threw out anyways, and still have good solid insights and results. So, I mean, it may come down to, if the industry doesn't want to try to fix the problem, I look at it as, if you're selling me a lemon, I'm on a car lot and you're selling me garbage, I'm not going to come back shopping at your lot again. So eventually enough is enough, and I'm going to start building my own car.
Great. I'll also say, to your point about throwing people out of the panel, I wish sample companies did that. Unfortunately, I won't name names, but for some panel companies, those are the most important people on their entire panel. Those are the money makers. Those are the people taking 20 surveys and doing all the research. Unfortunately, I wish all the industry threw them out.
I believe we talked about that in the past when I said, the suppliers are like pimps and they want the prostitutes that turn the most tricks. So those are the people who do the most surveys, and they want to keep them employed.
That's what I love about you, Tia. Thank you for that. Karine, final thoughts.
So on the quality of panel, I have, experience with some panels that are truly proprietary. There's one that I have in mind, and I can see that the quality is better. And when you start out with just having more confidence that the people are who they say they are, then you don't need to go all nuts with your the QC checks, right? But the reality is there aren't many panels like that, and you can never really be sure if they're going to aggregate or not. So my best advice I have for people is to own the tools and own the process, because you can't really trust that the suppliers can do that for you. And this is why I'm using multiple fraud detection software, because at least I know I have my layer in place no matter what I'm told.
Andrew, bring us home. Tie us together. You're good at this.
I'll do my best. It really does come down to two things. It's that all buyers of sample need to be discerning, and part of that discernment is, and we've been saying this for a decade, but again, if you're listening, you have to have transparency, and that transparency is that you are working one-to-one with a proprietary panel, maybe one layer, maybe one person is kind of being your contractor, but even then, that's really tough. It has to be proprietary, because otherwise there's no telling how deep the rabbit hole goes. And that's where we start to get the really concerning sample, is when you're 3, 4, 5 steps removed. When you get that far out, that's where the real professional respondents and actual fraud and bots and things like that come in. I will try to be a little bit positive. Like Karine just mentioned, I've found some good panels. There are people who are reacting to this situation by creating their own panels. They're going out, they're being entrepreneurial about it, they're trying to do things the right way. There are a few companies that have always kind of done this the right way, and it's tough because we lose a lot of studies based on price. Believe it or not, a small business owner cannot be recruited to and take your survey for $15. It's impossible. But I mentioned before, I kind of told the story, hey, I left the space, I came back, all the panels I used to buy from, the quality was gone. But in that same time frame as well, like, I found a few good panels. If we can support them, if we can be discerning buyers and give those panels business, they will grow and hopefully be able to meet those demands. Right now, unless it's a pretty simple study, they can't. And that's just the reality. But I'm hopeful that if we can change our buying habits, work with proprietary high quality panels, voting with our dollars, if you will, those panels will grow and then displace those panels who are providing poor quality or just non-transparent aggregators of aggregators of aggregators. Like you said.
Yep. Thank you for that, Andrew. I'll just add, when we say transparency, from my perspective, there's transparency and there's true transparency. Buyers of sample, and those of us, this is an echo chamber a little bit on the call, demand complete and utter transparency. Don't settle for the vague answers that you're going to get from panel companies. Ask them again and again, and go deeper and deeper to third and fourth level until you get very specifics. Join their panel. You can see their data quality methods. Join all their panels. I'll close with that. And, thank you all so much for joining this podcast. This is a heavy hitter, the fraud squad here. So fortunate to have you guys on. We really appreciate you for coming on. And we barely scratched the surface. When I said 3 hours, I think I said before the podcast we could do 3 hours. I think we could have done 30. And so thank you all so much for joining. And if you're still listening, thank you for listening. And if you have follow-up questions, send them to myself and Andrew, or if you know the others on this, you can go directly to them, or we'll filter them to them as well. So thanks again for listening, and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Brian.